like literally the same day I got my sucked by a chick with some big ass boobies, my fucking shirt arrives in the mail. What are the fucking odds? It was a joke. I know, it was a horrible joke, but I went for it.
In keeping with the prior episode's theme, this week, episode 119, we will again be covering death metal. It will again be Swedish, and it will again not really sound like Swedish death metal. Last week, we went over Seance, and they were heavily influenced by Floridian death metal, specifically of the monstrosity, brutality, and morbid angel-y variety. That was a lot of Y sounds. This week, we're covering two bands. We have Infestdead, which is a wonderfully stupid band name, like Infestdead, and Luciferion. These guys, however, pulled from a slightly different pool of American death metal influences. And in order to talk about either of these bands, there's one American band we're going to have to cover really quickly because these bands probably would not have existed without this American band. You got it ready to go?
안녕하세요, 트와이스 지우입니다.
That's right, it's our buddies in good old Deicide, who play some very important early death metal. Apparently, according to some measures, the first Deicide album is the best-selling death metal album of all time and was highly influential for how dissonant, chromatic, and just generally nasty sounding it was. You get a lot of these just really good palm-muted chugs, linking together more tremolo-y stuff. The absolutely bestial vocals of Glenn Benton, and just a really nasty, unholy atmosphere overall. But it's also relatively catchy, especially for how dissonant and evil it sounds. So that's a really good album. Second album, Legion, upped the technicality. For a while, this was a benchmark in the death metal world. It's only like half an hour long and it has maybe 100 riffs on it. I feel like some old dude trying to recommend Bela Lugosi movies to modern day horror fans. It'll only take up like an hour of your time, but it's amazing. This actually is really good though, to the point where a lot of times they don't even play songs from this album live because of how technical it is. Highly recommend that one though. You can actually get a completely different album experience depending on how you adjust the stereo balance. Both guitars are doing slightly different things. Even the bass playing is very technical. Third album, Once Upon the Cross, is a little bit simpler, but still very fast and brutal. There's slightly more of a melodic emphasis in the tremolo sections, and the palm muty groovy parts are substantially more groove-oriented, as opposed to the more thrashy bits on the earlier albums. So an interesting style change, and a very underrated album, I think. I enjoy quite a bit. Alright, the fourth Deicide album, Serpents of the Light. Possible black metal influence on riffs like this, although apparently Glenn Benton didn't get along with the black metal people, because he thinks the Norwegians tried to blow him up at a concert in the early 90s, even though it was actually proven to be some weirdo Antifa, like animal rights guys, which doesn't make sense at all because Gorefest was opening, and they're actually a very leftist band. I don't know what any of that. What a fucking mess. But Deicide, awesome band, but most people probably know that. They're like Morbid Angel or Obituary. After their first 4 albums, they pulled a Sepultura, and apparently like everybody died in a bus crash and was replaced with people that wrote dumb pop music disguised as death metal.
네, 여러분 안녕하세요. 오늘은
Look, I know you like it. I'm sorry. It just doesn't do much for me compared to the old stuff.
언제쯤 데뷔할 수 있을까라는 생각은 당연히 많이 했고.
Well, you're insinuating I'm a hypocrite because I claim to enjoy melodic death metal and don't like the more melodic Deicide albums? Listen, bud. Early Deicide is high fucking art, okay?
No, blue balls. Let me show you what it's all about.
A formative work for integration of theory into death metal, Deicide's self-titled album integrated the primitive musical activism of early death metal with the ambient tendencies of atonal music, drifting more into self-defining structure than less abstract works based on an arbitrary framework of musical value, with strips of chromatic chords thundering together in complex harmonic overlays.
근데 솔직히 어느 정도 맞는 것 같아.
Sorry, I get a little carried away sometimes. Imagine actually writing something like that. It would do such a thing. But anyways, that's Deicide. There's another band. Now we're finally getting into the main bands of this show. There's this band, Infestdead. It's a two-man project of Dan Svano and Andreas Axelsson from Edge of Sanity that was heavily influenced by Deicide and took it to new levels of extremity. The first thing they put out was like a little studio demo way back in 1993. That's actually a big part of why Dan Svano is in so many quote-unquote bands, because he had all these weird little studio projects. He did another one called Mastication with the guy from Abruptum. But this is Infestdead, and it was slightly longer-lived than that project. On this first album, it's not... first single, literally one song. It's not too Deicide-y. It's definitely a bit more Slayer-ish and thrashy, possibly a bit of necrophobic in there, but by the time the first album comes out, they're playing something that could almost be seen as a parody of Deicide with that very obvious drum machine and then the ranty vocals of Benton jacked up to 11 to where they're falling in lockstep with the rhythm of the music, become their own sort of musical voice, adding to the cacophony. This album, Hellfuck, is basically a cyber grind album. The songs are super fucking short and catchy in sort of a pop music way, but it's also very evil and nasty sounding. So I dig that album a lot, but their second one is where they really got good, if you ask me. This one fully embraces the drum machine to create some very mechanized death metal. Heavier groove focus, still very Deicide influence, particularly from the Once Upon the Cross album. Dan Svano's an interesting guy when it comes to death metal. He was originally a prog rock guy, who then got into death metal with Leprosy and Slayer. So he doesn't really sound like the other Swedish bands that much, although he did influence them. But this album is super interesting. It's got these just barbaric groove riffs over a drum machine, slicing and dicing them up in that obviously rhythmic vocal performance, coupled with the solos, which are mockingly melodic and dissonant at the same time, much in the tradition of the Hoffman brothers' work on the Deicide albums. So that's Infestdead. They only put out 2 albums. The other band that we're going to talk about also only put out 2 albums. And they're another band playing death metal in Sweden that came from a stranger background, much like Dan Svano did. So Dan Svano came out of progressive rock in the 80s and picked up death metal, thus making his own unique version of it that was very different from what was going on. These dudes, Luciferion, sort of pulled a reverse Hammerfall. So Hammerfall was a power metal band started by ex-enslaved guys. Luciferion was a death metal band started by guys from the power metal band Lost Horizon. Lost Horizon were interesting in that they were a European power metal band taking extreme metal techniques like that double bass type thing, but they didn't do the flower power like gay metal or Rhapsody where you just got that double bass and then like these like stupid melodic riffs. Instead, this almost sounds like power metal is written by death metal guys. The drums are quite a bit more extreme than would be normal for this type of music. The riffs hit quite a bit harder, and those little melodies definitely betray their Gothenburg roots. They're more in line with melodic death metal than classic power metal or the really lame stuff like Sonata Arctica. So Lost Horizon, very good. Their lyrics are also pretty Nietzschean will to power-ish. They actually didn't really need to change their lyrical style that much once they got into doing Luciferion stuff. Just make it a little bit more satanic, but essentially the same core of lyrical content about self-empowerment and rising above and all that. When I think of the first Luciferion album, I think of, well, obviously really good death metal, highly worth listening to, but also they're one of the few death metal bands I've heard utilize a China symbol effectively.
China, China, China.
China, 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 China.
I remember talking to one of the guys that used to be in Visaleth. He would utilize the China cymbals sort of as a way to introduce new musical phrases and twists and turns in the music. Luciferion does something similar. So right here we have these clusters of rolling double bass beats with the chuggy riffs, definite, obvious Deicide influence. This album used to be really hard to get, but now you can get it easy. There was that China cymbal. I don't know why I just picked that out. I was listening to it the other day, I was like, that's really weird that he uses a China cymbal. Very, un-death metal-y, but it works with the band, who are basically million miles a minute American-style death metal played by Swedes. There's also a bit of a malevolent creation in here, which makes sense because that band actually influenced a lot of Swedish guys, including In Flames and Hypocrisy, if you read old interviews. But they also have little atmospheric touches like this. They might slow it down a bit, put in some clean guitars, occasional keyboard drones. Overall makes it a very spooky experience. Like that. That's nice. I like that quite a bit. These little doomy sections help break up what would otherwise be a very monotonous album. So I like that one quite a bit, but actually, having gone back through their unfortunately very short catalog, I've noticed that my favorite stuff from them is actually on their second album. This album is super chaotic and strange, much heavier utilization of keyboards than the first one, but not really the same sort of thing you would hear from Nocturnus. Whereas I think that first Nocturnus album was essentially a guitar-oriented album with keyboard window dressing. Here, occasionally the keyboards will take more of a lead role, but they actually manage to keep it exceptionally chaotic and death metal the entire time. Look how technical these fucking weird riffs are. I don't know, nobody talks about this album, but it's good. That was a cool little keyboard bit. The drums are just absolutely savage. Lost Horizon is considered to be a progressive power metal band by some, and if that's the case, this would definitely be progressive death metal. I mean, this song right here is like 7 minutes long, and it's got, I think, like 6 different denoted sections with Roman numerals and whatnot. Check out what happens a little bit later on. Slow it down again and just get really dark and spooky with it. It's interesting that they can utilize keyboards but still remain a fairly dissonant and brutal death metal band. You'd never think these kind of Deicide type riffs would work with keyboards, but they do. Here's where the keyboards take more of a lead role in the melodies, especially on the slower sections like this. That is super cool. It sounds like if Goblin, that old Italian progressive rock band, did all the horror movie soundtracks, decided to play some very nasty death metal. For some reason, this album is not as rare and it's really easy to get. I don't know if that's why people talk about it less, because it seems less special, but for me, this is the superior album. Unfortunately, it's kind of short because they had to pad out the second half of it with recordings from their 94 demo. So that essentially is Luciferion and Infestdead, both bands that put out 2 albums in a very American death metal style, despite being from Sweden, and then subsequently vanishing. You might also include Hypocrisy in that.
그리고 진짜 제가 해보고 싶은 게
Well, yeah, obviously, Hypocrisy put out more albums than either of these guys, but they did put out only 2 albums in their original style, which was very malevolent creation and Deicide influence before switching to their own more unique way of doing some kind of melodic death metal thing. So if you can find Infestdead, definitely get that. It's pretty easy to get now, actually. I think Century Media reissued all their stuff, and then Luciferion, their first album's been reissued, and it's not too expensive. Their second album is still acquirable secondhand for like $2. So you got no fucking excuse. Go and listen to it, nerds.
Get those nerds!
And I'll see you around.
Also, gaggle. What would you call them? Hot? Fried? Cornucopia. What do you call a group of humans? An infestation. somebody's hype pack.